"This property now belongs to the bank," the auctioneer declared, as the old man bowed his head. Outside, neighbors shook their heads, no one daring to speak up. 3 generations of farming, lost with a single strike of the gavel. But then, the ground began to tremble slightly. The rumble of engines grew louder. A convoy of military vehicles appeared, blocking the courthouse entrance. The commander stepped out. "This court has no authority to sell a hero's property. Type honor if you believe loyalty never loses its value." Richard Mallory was an 83-year-old Korean War veteran who had lived over half a century on his family farm, growing corn, raising cattle, and preserving every stone of his ancestral legacy. After losing his wife and son, he lived alone, continuing to pay off the farm loan despite his meager income from the small operation that was more tradition than business now. Last year, he was tricked into signing a refinancing agreement with unfavorable terms, simply because he trusted the bank representative who had once been an old friend. The fine print contained provisions that would prove devastating. Without protection, without a lawyer, Richard soon found himself sued by the bank for failing to meet interest payment obligations. The technical terminology confused him, but the threat to his home was crystal clear. A foreclosure notice arrived in the mail. He attempted to file an appeal but was denied for missing the deadline. The complex legal language and requirements were intentionally difficult for an elderly farmer to navigate. On the auction day, Richard wore his old military jacket, the medals still pinned precisely where they had been decades ago. He arrived at the courthouse clinging to hope that he might receive an extension if they saw him in person, if they understood what this land meant to him. The auction manager's voice was cold and businesslike. "This property is no longer yours to claim." A potential buyer laughed loudly from the back of the room. "I guess you thought the army would come save you, huh?" Quiet laughter rippled through the courtroom. Richard silently sank into his seat, clutching a worn leather-wrapped family photograph. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he traced the faces of those he had lost. The local newspaper reporter jotted notes, not expecting anything newsworthy beyond the typical foreclosure story. Some neighbors who had gathered whispered among themselves, uncomfortable with what was happening, but unprepared to challenge the system. Richard stared at the wooden floor, remembering how his father had taught him to plow straight rows, how his son had learned to drive a tractor on the same fields that would soon belong to strangers. 3 generations of memories were being erased by financial calculations and legal paragraphs he never fully understood. The moisture in his eyes wasn't from sadness alone. It came from the quiet rage of a man who had fought for his country only to be abandoned by the institutions he had protected. Yet he maintained his dignity, back straight despite the weight of his years and his loss. No one in the room seemed to notice the irony of an American flag hanging directly behind the auctioneer's podium. The bank official gestured to continue. "Lot number 9, Mallory Farm, starting bid at $40,000. A buyer raised his paddle. No one else competed. Richard stood up, his voice shaking. "Please, give me 30 more days. I can make the payment." But the answer came swiftly. "I'm sorry, sir. You've exhausted all extensions." No one objected. No one spoke up. Outside, his neighbors, people whose tractors he had repaired, whose calving cows he had saved in midnight emergencies, stood with lowered heads, silent witnesses to the dissolution of a family legacy. A gavel strike echoed through the room. "Sold!" But just as the auction was about to record the new owner, a court clerk rushed in and whispered something to the judge. His face grew pale. "What? What's happening?" "There's a military convoy parked right at the main entrance." Outside, 6 Humvees and a command vehicle were positioned strategically. Soldiers in full uniform stood at attention, creating an unmistakable barrier to anyone attempting to leave. The commander, Colonel Gregory Mills, entered the courtroom, his voice resonating with authority. "We represent the National Veterans Association. We request an immediate stay on all foreclosure proceedings related to Richard Mallory." The bank official protested, "The process has been completed." The colonel produced a hand-delivered letter signed by a state senator, demanding an investigation into the foreclosure that showed signs of predatory lending and legal misconduct. The entire courtroom fell silent. Richard quietly asked, "How do you know me?" The colonel smiled. "Because you saved my father's life in 1952. Now it's my turn to save your home. The mood in the room shifted dramatically. The would-be buyer lowered his paddle. The bank representative began flipping frantically through his documents, suddenly concerned about certain clauses. Richard stood straighter now, decades seeming to fall away from his posture. The other veterans in the room, who had been silent before, now moved to stand beside him, a quiet show of solidarity that needed no words. One elderly neighbor stepped forward, voice cracking with emotion. "I should have spoken earlier. Richard gave me seed when my crop failed in '83. Never asked for anything back." Another voice from the back. "He taught my son to farm when I was deployed overseas." The stories continued until the judge raised his hand for silence, looking directly at the bank representative. "I'm issuing a temporary restraining order against this foreclosure pending full investigation." The colonel placed a steady hand on Richard's shoulder. "No veteran should lose their home because of predatory practices, not while we have the power to stand together. If you believe no one deserves to lose their home simply because of age, type honor to share this story." The incident made headlines. Auction halted by military convoy defending veterans' farm. Upon investigation, the court discovered the bank had concealed terms and deliberately arranged an unreasonably low sale price to a pre-selected buyer who happened to be developing luxury properties in the area. The contract was voided. Richard kept his land. The state council passed a resolution. No foreclosure against veterans over 75 years old without mandatory legal representation and review. Those who had laughed at Richard in court quietly sent letters of apology, some including checks to help with future payments. A local school began bringing students to visit Richard's farm monthly as part of their living history program. The children listened wide-eyed as he showed them how farming had changed over 7 decades, from horse-drawn plows to GPS-guided tractors. Volunteers from surrounding counties helped repair the farm, preserving the original wooden sign that read, "Mallory Farm, once protected country, now protected by country." Colonel Mills maintained regular contact, sending a postcard every month with the same message. "Heroes don't belong in museums. They live among us." When interviewed by local media, Richard simply said, "I never thought I was special. I just never imagined that one day soldiers would protect me from bankers." People began sharing his story as a symbol of the phrase, "No one left behind." The bank faced significant public backlash. Their regional manager appeared at Richard's farm personally, offering a new mortgage at a significantly reduced rate, with transparent terms and reasonable payment schedules. He admitted the previous contract had been designed to fail, part of a larger scheme to acquire agricultural land for development. Richard's case sparked a nationwide review of veteran foreclosures. Similar predatory practices were uncovered in dozens of counties, leading to class action lawsuits and new protective legislation. At the State House during the signing of the Mallory Act that would protect elderly veterans from predatory lending, Richard stood uncomfortable in the spotlight, but recognized the importance of his presence. "I'm not doing this for me," he told a reporter. "I'm doing it for the young soldier who will be old someday, wondering if what they sacrifice for still values them." The colonel, now a regular visitor to the farm, often brought younger veterans to meet Richard. They would sit on the porch, sharing stories across generations, building bridges between different wars but similar experiences. "The enemy changes," Richard would tell them, "but the courage doesn't." By spring, Richard's farm was operational again, with neighboring farmers volunteering time and equipment to ensure crops would be planted. The military convoy had long since departed, but every veteran in 3 counties knew if Richard ever needed them again, they would come. On Memorial Day, when Richard visited the cemetery to place flowers on his wife's grave, he found dozens of flags lining the road to his farm, a quiet acknowledgement from the community that had finally found its voice. "I fought for land I never saw," Richard reflected, "but I never expected to have to fight for the land I've always known." Each morning, Richard sits on the bench in his front yard, his old dog beside him, gazing across the familiar fields. When someone asks what moved him most about the whole experience, he smiles. "It wasn't keeping the land. It was realizing I was still remembered as someone who once stood for others." A new sign now stands beside the farm entrance. "Mallory Farm, unbreachable." Visitors come in increasing numbers, not to see the property, but to learn about preserving honor. The story has inspired similar interventions across the country. When a Vietnam veteran in Oregon faced foreclosure, local veterans organized a peaceful presence at the bank until terms were renegotiated. When a Desert Storm veteran in Florida couldn't pay medical bills threatening his home, anonymous donations arrived with notes saying simply, "Remember Mallory Farm." Richard established a small trust from donations received, creating a fund to provide legal counsel to veterans facing housing insecurity. The No Hero Homeless Initiative now operates in 7 states. Some people lose everything, only to keep one thing: loyalty to what they once sacrificed for. The real power wasn't in stopping an auction, it was in awakening a community to its forgotten responsibilities. If you believe loyalty deserves protection, subscribe to TT Hero Stories. TT Hero Stories, because some heroes never stop serving,